When I was younger, my dad bought this plug-and-play console with a few games including Miss Pac-Man and Galaga. I rarely played it as a child, but recently, in light of me being a pretentious game design YouTuber, I decided to pull it out and give it a go. Overall, I had a good time with it, but I was surprised to see just how much I enjoyed it, specifically Galaga. I sank several hours into it, getting high scores and just having a good time. Shortly after, Steam had a sale in which Galaga was just $1, so I decided to pick it up on there. However, the Galaga I got on Steam isn't the same Galaga I'm playing on the plug-and-play console. This isn't because it's a bad port or anything like that, but actually because of the monumentally different controller. Here's the plug-and-play console again. As you can see, it has a cartoonishly big joystick and two buttons, one much larger than the other, but both are much bigger than the buttons on your average controller. Typically, I'll hold the controller like this to play, which is immediately different from how I'll use the keys on a keyboard. Of course, it's also very different from how I'll use a standard controller as well. The plug-and-play controller has me using the joystick very delicately with multiple fingers, and it makes a satisfying click noise. The buttons also give some resistance and loud feedback. It makes me feel like I'm playing it on an arcade cabinet. Using a keyboard gives me flashbacks to old games I'd play on Newgrounds, no pun intended, and while I don't hate it, I strongly prefer the plug-and-play. Despite movement being digital in Galaga, something about the analog stick feels more satisfying. That said, I wasn't in love with the standard controller either. It was better than the keyboard, but the use of just a thumb on the joystick doesn't compare to the agile precision when using two fingers on a joystick like on the plug-and-play. Of course, I couldn't leave it there. I wanted to see if there was any way to recreate this feeling on PC, so I dusted off my flight controllers, and strangely enough, even they don't compare to the plug-and-play. Even though the flight stick seems slightly reminiscent of the plug-and-play, the way my hand cradles around it is very different from the way my two fingers pinch the joystick. To move using the flight stick, I'm moving my entire wrist, whereas the plug-and-play sees me just moving these few fingers. It started to feel as though maybe, just maybe, the controller you use to play a game has an outstanding effect on how that game is perceived when played. It seemed like an audacious concept, so I decided to test it out the only way I knew how. I pulled out the DDR controller and played Galaga one last time. The results were conclusive. The controller matters. Well, that last part is a joke. I did try it just for fun, but I knew it would be different. The main idea I'm trying to make in this video is that the controller matters far more than we think. It's no secret that playing a first-person shooter on a mouse and keyboard is almost nothing like using a controller's joysticks. But I think the nuances of controller-specific features are heavily downplayed in other ways as well. If two people play the same game using different controllers, they're inevitably going to consume the game differently. I'd go as far as to say that even two controllers with near identical button placement can impose an entirely different feeling when playing. This video aims to spread light on this as an idea, present a few examples, and invite discussion about how games can learn from this. Despite being very similar to one another, there are ways to differentiate the experience of using the standard default controller. For one thing, the joysticks are in different spots on all of these, and while that's not going to have a drastic effect on gameplay, I can't help but feel as though it'll change some dynamics in some games, if only slightly. I think it's fair to assume that these controllers are designed to be homogeneous to one another in an attempt to minimize these discrepancies, especially since they're sort of competing with one another. Because of this, I think we'd get more out of the discussion if we were to look at controllers that are based on this standard rather than these standards themselves. The first one I'm going to look at is the Logitech F310. As a whole, it's just a decent controller, but it also has a button that instantly swaps the inputs for the D-pad and joystick. Strangely enough, I found myself using it mid-game to accommodate for different control types. For example, in Mark of the Ninja, you stealthily traverse a side-scrolling 2D environment, and I personally liked using the D-pad for this movement. But in order to throw items, you have to enter this pause state in which movement inputs are now mapped to item trajectory, which is analog. The D-pad doesn't really work here since it only lets you throw in 4 directions. So I would always swap them whenever I entered the state, throw my items, then swap back to return to my previous style of play. This wouldn't have been possible on another controller. Next, we have the Steam controller, which is by far the most ergonomic of the bunch. I could do a whole other video outlining how different this thing is from your typical controller, but what I actually want to talk about isn't so obvious at a glance. Yes, of course it is missing a D-pad and a right stick, but what you can't actually see is that it also has 2 extra buttons on the bottom. Most of the buttons on a controller are accessed by your thumbs, with the shoulder buttons in reach of the index and middle finger. But these hidden buttons rest gently under the remaining fingers used to grip the device. Since the player's thumbs are occupied by a maximum of 2 buttons at a time, you can't always make some actions simultaneously. Imagine you're playing a first-person game on controller. You want to move, turn the camera, and jump all at the same time. On a standard controller, this would require moving the left and right joysticks at the same time, while also pressing whichever button is used to jump, let's say the A button on this controller. You'll either need to bring a new finger to the controller's face, or angle your right thumb awkwardly to be doing 2 of these tasks at once. Both of these are incredibly uncomfortable, but this is easy on a Steam controller. The right stick controls movement, the left circle pad controls camera, and the grip button makes you jump. It's easy to forget that no matter how many buttons a controller has, a player can only access so many at a time. To demonstrate this better, I bought this controller a few years ago, thinking it'd be cool to have an extra 2 buttons. Unfortunately, it changes play far less than you'd think, since I pretty much only ever press 1 button at a time. The Steam controller does a better job doing what this one was aiming for. The last standard controller I want to address is the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con. Their versatility and portability allows us to examine traits of controllers that we otherwise overlook, most notably the comfort of holding a controller. Rather than having a direct effect on gameplay, this has more of an impact on how a player approaches a game. When playing a game with a standard controller, your hands are usually together. No matter how you're sitting or lying, the hands need to be centralized to one point, which can be limiting and potentially uncomfortable. The Joy-Con are a full controller and 2 disjoint devices, so your hands can be wherever you'd like. Of all the neat stuff the Joy-Con are capable of, I think this is one of the most underlooked. Whatever position you want to be in, your hands can go where you please while maintaining comfortable play. Instead of hunching over tensely into a game, I'm more at ease and relaxed. Gameplay doesn't influence my position, rather my position influences gameplay. I go into games with a softer mood like this. I know that sounds hippy-dippy, maybe I'm the weird one, but it's cathartic, alright? Don't judge. The Nintendo Wii had something similar with the Wiimote and Nunchuck, but the cable between them could get in the way, few games really took advantage of this controller setup, and the button scheme isn't even traditional in the first place. I remember getting Guitar Hero 2 on PlayStation 2 and it came with a red guitar controller. Whenever my brothers and I would want to play multiplayer though, one of us would have to use the traditional PlayStation 2 controller, which, needless to say, is not even kind of similar to the feel of wielding a plastic guitar. Later on, we obtained Guitar Hero 3 and it came with a black guitar controller, so we were excited to have a more legitimate multiplayer experience at our fingertips. Yet we quickly found that it still wasn't the same as the red guitar. As you can see, the red guitar's buttons are curved and don't stick out very far, so it's easy to glide your fingers across it as you play the game. The black guitar's buttons are sharper around the edges and have much more resistance when pushing them in, so it's difficult to slide your hand up and down the buttons. It's especially noticeable just comparing how it sounds to press the buttons in. This makes playing the game marginally more difficult, and at times it even hurts my fingers to play. I recognize that this is, ironically, the opposite to the issue I had in Galaga, where I found myself preferring the clicky button of the plug-and-play over the soft button presses of the traditional controller. I think this ties into game feel. In Galaga, the button is used to attack, so it feels good when it has some energy to it. The visceral pleasure of slamming the button and having clicky feedback works. And I don't think that works with Guitar Hero, at least not on the frets. On a real guitar, your fingers will flow across the frets nicely, just like the red guitar controller. Meanwhile, the black guitar controller's buttons feel more akin to playing a piano since it goes in deeper. Pressing in the frets isn't really supposed to do much. Instead, the power from this controller comes from strumming the guitar, which is why it makes a click sound. Designers should consider how much resistance is in the buttons of the potential controllers people will be using to play, and whether they want an action to have power to it like an attack, or be more of a smooth action like movement. If I had to guess, this is probably why Super Meat Boy recommends playing on a controller rather than a keyboard and mouse. A controller's joystick has smoother movement to it than the clicky keys on a keyboard, which is why the controller tends to be more conducive to fast-paced platforming. Obviously, there are tons of examples I haven't listed. This is partially because I want to keep this video a decent length, but it's also because there are tons of examples I don't know, so be sure to leave a comment with any examples you can think of.